I can't think of another movie I've gone to that had as much hype going into it as Everything Everywhere All at Once. I have a friend who runs a small organization, and he was literally giving his team PTO to go see this movie, so that's saying something. When I went opening night with my wife, those expectations were so high I was wondering how could this movie possibly live up to them. But you know what? It kinda did. And at the very least, I'm still sitting here wondering, like, by the time this sinks in more, is this gonna be one of my favorite films of all time? Maybe. I've seen so many takes about what this film is about. It's about intergenerational trauma. It's about our internet addictive attention deficit culture. It's about queer identity or erasure or losing religious faith, optimistic nihilism, our current state of chaos. Maybe it's just about kindness. And you know what? Yes. Yes to all of that. It's about all those things. I'm one of those people who thinks art is supposed to be subjective to a pretty high degree, and so whatever you saw in there that was significant to you is significant. I'm talking about the meaning of Everything Everywhere All at Once, but by that I mean what it meant to me, what I found meaningful, because this is the kind of film where afterwards you want to talk about it. I walk out of the theater just looking at my wife wondering, like, did you see that the same way I did? I'm gonna say spoiler alert here. I don't know if it's possible to spoil this film though. It's in some ways spoiler proof. I could watch it again and again. At the same time, it would be pretty neat to see it like with fresh eyes for the first time, to like Eternal Sunshine myself to do that. So yeah, I'm just saying spoiler alert so I could speak pretty freely. I suspect that a majority of people would say that the past 2 years have been the most exhausting 2 years of their lives. So much is changing, and at the same time, everything feels stuck. There's a pandemic, political upheaval, war, disaster, debate, debate, debate. Everything in life seems designed to fight for our attention. Every inch of visual space is maximized, every 2-second hook. You get tired of debating, you just want to live. There's bills to pay, there's kids to take care of, but like, how do you keep caring when there's so much to care about? There's too much to be outraged at, too much to pay attention to, too much to keep up with. It was 2016 when Daniels, the team of directors, started working on Everything Everywhere All at Once, and it's weird to think about 2016 as a simpler time, but compared to today, it totally is. At the same time, you can kind of see that that's kind of the point where the world started to drift towards the atmosphere of chaos we are now entrenched in. There's been so much commentary since that point about how polarized the world is, and that's true, but I think it goes deeper. It's like, not only do we disagree, we're just not seeing the same world as each other most often. It's like we're living in separate universes. Every person's newsfeed is literally different. We have more options than we ever have on how to pick and choose the things we want to pay attention to, things that interest us, things that already fit the way we see the world. And this seems like it could be an empowering thing, but it's actually one of the biggest contributors to this current environment. Daniel Kwan shared an extended post on Twitter talking about how this was kind of the starting block for the film. He talked about how with all the demands for everyone's attention, asking people to sit down in front of a movie screen for 2 hours was actually a pretty tall order. So they wanted to make a film that felt worthy of that ask, a film that could possibly change somebody's life. They wanted one that can also confront the absurdity, the chaos, and the noise we've been living in lately. And honestly, I think they nailed it. So you're living in a noisy world. How do you make your way through all that noise? Empathy. Empathy is a core theme in Everything Everywhere All at Once. When you're living in a world where you sort of choose your own reality, that only adds to the noise. But when you step fully into somebody else's reality and just try and appreciate everything that they've gone through or are dealing with, it kind of brings peace and quiets everything down. This film, by its end, really goes into depth about, how that provides meaning. But even at its start, it does this by demonstrating empathy, by giving a scene that anyone with a chaotic life feels seen by. Here's what I'm talking about. The scene begins with Evelyn at her desk just poring over receipts and tax documents, trying to put out a bunch of fires. She's trying to talk to her husband, trying to talk to her daughter at the same time. She's caring for her elderly dad. She's running a laundromat. There's this other layer to the scene that a lot of people will miss, which is that to English or non-Chinese speaking audiences, this will just seem like a scene that's mostly in Chinese with a bit of English, but Evelyn's actually doing quite a bit of code switching here. There's the Chinese dialogue, right? When Evelyn's talking to her husband or daughter, she's speaking Mandarin, and her Mandarin isn't quite native Mandarin. The actress Michelle Yeoh learned Mandarin during her role in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, but when she's speaking to her dad, she's speaking their more native Cantonese, which is a total accurate representation of how, families from the same country still might have different cultural roots than each other. I personally love this attention to detail. I grew up in a Filipino home, but my parents were from different regions. They grew up speaking different dialects from each other, so what I got was a little bit of that plus English. It's the reason why my ability to understand either of those languages is way better than my ability to speak it. But anyways, the effect that this gives to the film is just disjointedness and chaos and just lots of back and forth. I went into this opening scene thinking, this is the most chaotic sequence I've seen. And that's just the start. When everyone has their own different way of seeing things, when it feels like we're all talking, but we're not talking to each other, we're talking past each other, it doesn't just make the world feel noisy. After a while, it starts to feel meaningless. When I was in late high school, early college, I was extremely bothered by this. For me, it wasn't so much the noise of the world, it was just the fact that it didn't seem to have much of a point. I really resonated with the book of Ecclesiastes, like that thing made me feel seen. It's like the existentialist part of the Bible that is mostly a rant about how we're here until we're not, and how the in-between just feels pointless and up in smoke. What I kept observing was that people would spend their days working so hard so that they could have food and pay rent, and they did all that just so they could have what it takes to survive to the next day, wherein they would work hard to eat food and pay rent, and so on and so on. From my point of view, everyone was just so fixated on this routine that they never really questioned why, never really thought about like what else this is for other than to just keep doing it over and over again. I feel like hearing this would surprise a lot of people because right now I'm like very purpose oriented and I kind of see these connections and meanings in pretty much everything, but I don't think I would be there, honestly, if I hadn't gone through this process of having to like build it up from this sense of nothingness. What is the meaning of life feels like such a cliched question, so I hated asking it. I hated admitting that that's what was going on in my mind, but it's true. And I think for anyone who's been there, you know it can be that weight of existential dread. It can be a very heavy, very life-draining thing to be fixated on. Okay, now if you're up for some philosophy talk, that sense that life has no meaning or value is pretty much nihilism in a nutshell. And you know that's the belief system, the school of thought most associated with Nietzsche. Like a lot of philosophers, I think Nietzsche gets misunderstood. People think that this is like what he was advocating for. He was like, yay, nihilism. He actually saw it as a problem to be solved, but he also saw this as just this phenomenon that needed to be seriously explored as Christianity was declining all around Europe. He kind of came to the conclusion that there were two ways to deal with this existential dread. One was a more passive way where you just detach from desire and just try and minimize suffering in the world, but yeah, just let things go. And then there's the more active response of taking apart old values, old systems of belief, and building back something that maybe we know is subjective but does provide us with meaning. This concept, the state of nihilism, is embodied in the character of Jobu Tapaki, one of my favorite character names now, and she is this being from one of the universes who's figured out how to see every universe at once, see the whole thing, who then finds it meaningless and is now on a mission to destroy it all because it's so meaningless to her. We're told that Evelyn, who at this point we just know as a middle-aged Chinese woman trying to file taxes and run a laundromat, is the only one who can stop her. And we eventually learn that Jobu Tabaki is her daughter in another universe. Jobu Tabaki has been to all the universes. In fact, I think she is kind of in all of them at the same time, or at least is seeing them all. Not quite sure how it works. But because she's seen it all, she's kind of concluded that nothing is worth it. There's nothing here that has meaning, nothing holds it together. And this combination of existential boredom plus just the pressure she's received from her family and the lack of acceptance is moving her to put the world out of its misery by making a very literal everything bagel that has everything on it and is now just sucking up and consuming all of reality. So that's nihilism in the film, and I think some of the scenes that follow shortly afterwards reflect another school of thought, absurdism. So absurdism is most associated with Albert Camus. He comes to the conclusion that, yeah, perhaps the universe is devoid of meaning, but it's human nature to try and find meaning. Humans are meaning-making machines. And so we're gonna look for it. We're gonna look for meaning out of the meaningless, and that conflict is the conflict that drives the story of humanity. There's this tension, and there are only three outcomes. First is to be destroyed by the meaninglessness. Now, Camus was literally talking about suicide or losing one's resolve to keep living. Again, he was not advocating for it. In fact, he argued that even though life might be meaningless, it's still kind of a miracle, and so to end it would make the meaningless somehow even more meaningless. The second option is to simply embrace the absurd, and now Camus refers to the myth of Sisyphus. He's the Greek figure who's just constantly pushing a boulder up a mountain to have it roll back down again, and he says, if we're just stuck in this endless cycle, we might as well find a way to enjoy rolling the boulder up the mountain. Over the past century, absurdism has found its way to be expressed quite a bit in the world of art, especially in plays like The Bald Soprano or Waiting for Godot. A lot of the books, music, movies I enjoy all have a lot of influence coming from absurdism. The music of The Gorillaz or Vampire Weekend, books by Kurt Vonnegut or Haruki Murakami, or movies like The Lighthouse or Swiss Army Man, which is Daniel's other big film project. I think Everything Everywhere All at Once does this huge wink to absurdist fiction like Waiting for Godot in the way that the characters jump universes. So because universes split off every time people make a different decision, the way to hop between one or the other involves making a choice that is just so absurd, so ridiculous and illogical that it flings you to another universe. This includes being in the middle of a fight and eating a thing of chapstick, or being in the big brawl and then taking a nap, or professing your love to somebody who's trying to chase after you. Evelyn starts jumping universes because in order to fight, or at least not be killed by Chobutapaki, she needs to pick up these skills that she has in parallel versions of herself. So she learns these knife skills from the world in which she's a hibachi chef. She learns how to fight from a world where she's a kung fu star. She learns how to use a shield in a world where she's like spinning one of those like, there's a sale signs. And as she's visiting these alternate universes, they just seem to get progressively more and more absurd. There's one where like she and her daughter are just like silent rocks overlooking the Grand Canyon. There's one where everyone has hot dog fingers. There's one where her hibachi chef counterpart is basically living out the plot of Ratatouille, but with a raccoon, just because her mom misremembered the movie title as Ratatouille. So the sheer chaos of the film kind of peaks as Evelyn and Joy are just chasing each other around, hopping from one universe to another in rapid fire succession. This is all happening at the same time as Evelyn is dealing with this massive brawl in an IRS office. I think it's happening at the same time. It's kind of hard to tell, and it's kind of by design that it's hard to tell. Evelyn is really close to giving into the nothing matters philosophy herself. She's on the verge of following Chobutapaki right into the heart of the all-consuming everything bagel. But what's holding her back is her husband, Waymond, played by Ki-Hai Kwan, and he just drops this fire monologue about how even though it's all teetering on the verge of chaos and oblivion, we can still choose to be kind. He talks about how gentleness, kindness is not weakness at all. It's a strength, it's a necessary strategic move. I love the way he delivers these lines. That said, as great as this monologue was, I feel like I would not have been sufficiently satisfied if that was the entire conclusion, if that was the entire message of the film. Just like, everything is meaningless, but be kind doesn't 100% cut it for me. Thankfully, that's just a setup for the emotional heart of this film. What Waymond introduces as kindness is so much bigger. It encompasses healing generational trauma, living at peace with ourselves, accepting others totally as they are, empathy, and accepting the fact that we contain multitudes. All these things help us find a way to be together, which is ultimately where Evelyn finds purpose and peace despite the nihilism bagel. This is one of the reasons why I really appreciate that it's an Asian story and an immigrant story. I think that adds a real special layer to the story that's being told here.
Action speaks louder than words. When you have a story that's told like this, then the Asian Americans, the Asian community, or any immigrants can look up and say, my story matters. It needs to be told.
It's funny because like a month ago, I tweeted out images from Turning Red and Pachinko talking about how we've got a really exciting month of Asian stories ahead of us, and I didn't even see this one coming. This was like the big one. The character of Evelyn is a middle-aged immigrant from China. First of all, how often do you see those stories being told? In American society, she's exactly the sort of person we are so quick to just put in a box and allow to be invisible or isolated. The more and more I learn about just the deep isolation that Asian elders in the US have to live with, coupled with the threats against their safety, I'm more and more bothered of how dismissive we are about the fact that these lives contain so many rich stories, so many rich experiences, and we just look right past it. One thing that's cool is that as Evelyn's hopping universes, we start to see different variations of her life, different paths she could have taken, different ways things could have turned out. We see the moment where she's born and where her dad is told, I'm so sorry, it's a girl. And from there, we start to get a little bit more understanding as to some of the things that have shaped her. We see when he disapproved of her marriage. We see one timeline where she got married and one where she didn't. We see one where instead she never moved to the US and ended up becoming a glamorous superstar in China. So much of the time you see these things happen in movies and it's like it's a wonderful life. The conclusion is that, whoa, I've seen how things could be different, but now that makes me appreciate my current life so much more. I'm so thankful, except in Everything Everywhere All at Once, she gets to see this and she returns to tell Wayman, like, hey, there's this other world out there where we never got married, and you know what? That's really cool. I loved my life where I was a movie star. And you know, when you move to a new country, especially if this is something you do as an adult, you do spend a lot of time asking yourselves, like, how different could have everything been if I just stayed? What would life be like? That's why I think the actors who played Wayman and Evelyn couldn't have been better. Like, you have Michelle Yeoh, who's this amazing actress, this martial arts legend. Most folks recognize her from Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, but this is her first time really leading in a Hollywood movie. She's led in a bunch of Cantonese action movies throughout the 90s, but her first time doing so in Hollywood, and I'm so glad this is a role that allows her to play like dozens of characters in the same film and switch it up, because we've got some ground to make up on. And it's probably even worse for Ki Hai Kwan as Wayman. Most people recognize him from Indiana Jones or The Goonies, but what happened in between then and now was he had to stop acting, not by choice. I heard him on a podcast interview where he really loved acting, but as he started to grow out of these little kid roles, he would just wait and wait for phone calls.
When I fell in love with acting and when I really want to pursue it and wanted to do it for the rest of my life, then it wasn't there for me. It was just tough for an Asian actor working in Hollywood at that time.
I love the way he puts it, though. He paved the way for a future generation of Asian American actors. Also, they could pave the way for him to come back. Anyway, this is a film about acceptance. It's acceptance for our lot in life, acceptance of reality, and acceptance of the people around us. I love that Evelyn was the main character of this too. I think in a lot of ways it would have been easier to make this film from the daughter's perspective. Think of a lot of the Asian American or Asian stories we've seen over the past few years, from Turning Red to Over the Moon to Crazy Rich Asians, and these are always through the eyes of the younger generation, which kind of makes sense because that's where the filmmakers come from. They're the kids who grow up to be the creators who then tell these stories. But the older generation also has its own point of view. They have their own stories and they deserve to be told. The only example off the top of my head that I can think of that does this was Alan Yang's Tiger Tail, which is also a really good movie. Maybe in some ways the parent scenes from Kim's Convenience, I might give that some credit. But we still see this perspective so rarely. Daniel Kwan, the director, is a dad to a toddler, and I've seen some interviews kind of talking about how he was able to draw from that experience quite a bit. In the past couple of years, I've become a dad. I've become a dad to 3, and that's also brought my mom a lot closer to our lives. She comes over a few times each week to help with the childcare, and being able to see multiple generations in one roof has just given me this vantage point that helps me appreciate all of it a lot more. One of the big driving tensions in the film is Joy's struggle to find acceptance for her queer identity from her mom. But I love this because it sets up the film's climax, its most powerful moment, which happens in the parking lot of the laundromat. And it comes after all this absurdity, all this universe jumping, just chaos after chaos after chaos for like a whole straight hour. It then gets really quiet, and it's just a shared moment between mother and daughter. And I think part of the reason why that moment landed so well is because it's a moment of acceptance that a lot of people just don't get, where they get to be accepted for their authentic selves, their identities, their broken parts. We get to see Michelle Yeoh be both a superhero and an exhausted mom. We also get to see Joy be both a supervillain and a devourer of universes and just like a teenager. So this movie is wild and expansive for 2 straight hours. Joy and her mom start trying to make amends. Her mom tells her dad, Joy's grandpa, that Joy's friend, her good friend, is actually her girlfriend, to try and right a past wrong. And Joy's still, not feeling it. She's still overwhelmed by the nihilism and the hurt. So, her mom, who has now seen her life as a romantic, as an action star, as a celebrity, then affirms her by saying, like, of all the places I could be, I still want to be here with you. That part stood out to me on so many levels. As a parent, you know that whatever is occupying your kid's mind ends up becoming your whole world for that season, and it's never really about that thing. It's just about connecting with your kid. This also reminded me of my own journey. I kind of mentioned earlier how there were those 3 responses Camus talked about to nihilism. One was to just be buckling underneath the weight of it, and the other one was to just like find your own entertainment, to stay amused. The third way is to surrender to something that transcends the absurd. Traditionally, philosophers have thought of this as religion, but it can also be something like love or justice. Camus was kind of more of an advocate for the option of embracing the absurd and just going with it, that second option. He thought of the idea of surrendering to an adopted belief as just philosophical suicide. That's pretty much what he called it. The way he saw it, you were just like playing make-believe that something is true and then accepting the rigidity, the codes that it imposes. But someone, on the other hand, who seemed to view it in a more positive light was Soren Kierkegaard. He acknowledged the ways that believing in God or anything beyond the absurd were a little irrational and empirically improvable. But he also thought it was valuable and perhaps wise to be grounded in something. He noted that to get there, it often took a leap of faith that you couldn't quite prove. This is the same guy who said one of my favorite quotes: "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forward." Coming out of my own existential struggle, or whatever you want to call it, included faith, the return to faith, the Christian faith, but it wasn't rooted in moral codes the way I grew up with or was introduced to. They were more like core truths that matched experiences, like God is love, and that's reflected in our relationships with one another, and that those get restored and redeemed. That then allows us to seek justice and to live fully. And then I started to live as though these things were true, kind of to see what would happen. The more I did that, the more it just became easier to see purpose, to see connection. It became harder to unsee. One of the pieces of art that really stood out to me at this time was the song Impossible Soul off this record by Sufjan Stevens. It is an absolutely weird song. It's 26 minutes long. It starts off as this minimalistic, really simple song, and then it just turns into a dance party halfway through. Some of my favorite lyrics are, "In the wrong life, everything is chance. Does it register? Do you want to dance? In the right life, it's a miracle. Possibilities. Do you want to dance?" It's kind of like you can choose to see everything as chance and randomness and chaos, or you can entertain the possibility of miracles and something bigger. So for me, a big practice after that existential crisis became storytelling, initially through taking pictures. That was a big one. I started this project where I would take a photo a day. I said I would do it for a year, this is something I saw other people do, and I would use that to pay more attention to beauty and stories and just further engage the world around me. I did this for 1 year, and I noticed all these threads that tied together different storylines in my life. I felt so deeply grateful for them. This project that I meant to do for a year, I ended up doing for 12 years. I'm still doing it because it's provided that much value. It's exciting to look over the big adventures, the peak moments, the core memories over the past 12 years, but it's also really meaningful to look at the simpler, more mundane parts of life that tie them all together. My absolute favorite line in the movie is where Waymond from one universe is talking to the Evelyn that we've been tracking the whole time, And he just acknowledges that even though you've broken my heart yet again, I wanted to say that in another life, I would have really liked just doing laundry and taxes with you. It's kind of clever because this movie is set in so many different universes, but at the same time, it largely just happens in two places, an IRS office and a laundromat. If those aren't two great symbols of the mundaneness and the cycle of life, I don't know what is. I also think it's clever and perhaps intentional that this movie was released to theaters like a week before taxes were due. When you have this outlook on life that just assumes purpose to everything, even if it takes a leap of faith to get there, it takes that spiral of meaninglessness and just starts to spin it in the opposite direction. Suddenly, everything starts to become meaningful. My favorite way that the film shows this is by basically revisiting all these absurd universes and all these like diverging storylines that have then been opened up and then making them make sense. We go back to see the silent rocks and the hot dog fingers and the world of Rakakuni, and then we get to see Evelyn get back to all her parallel selves there, and we see their storylines move forward in ways that are actually really, really satisfying. In a world where we all have hot dogs for fingers, we get really good at using our feet. I don't really know how to end this thing, but I guess the one other thing to highlight was ever since I've seen Everything Everywhere, I've also been thinking a lot about this book. It's a book I read to my kiddos. It's a kid's book. I imagine that the overlap in the Venn diagram of people who've read this and who have seen Everything Everywhere all at once is really, really small. I wonder if anyone else is there. But if they are, I want to talk about this thing because it's a story of a father and son who are just goofing around. They make a pizza, they put everything on it, so then the universe collapses because that's what happens when you try and pile everything onto a pizza. It feels like it has a yin and yang relationship with Everything Everywhere all at once. Like the father-son dynamic here is like healthy and they're playing and they still collapse the universe and then have to rebuild it. So just a thing.